My true story from Illinois. When my son called my wedding rings useless clutter to save his business, he didn't know that hidden in the jewelry box was a document proving I owned 51% of that company. I let him take the jewelry so I could take everything else. My name is Eleanor, and for 5 years, I was a ghost. My true story begins in Illinois after my husband James passed away, and the silence in our big house on Maple Street became a weight too heavy for one person to bear. So when my son, Mark, and his wife Brenda suggested I move in with them, it felt like a lifeline, thrown into a sea of quiet grief. I sold the house that held 40 years of my life, the place where I had raised my son, and I gave them a significant portion of the proceeds to help them start their new life. I packed my memories into 3 suitcases and thought I was moving into a family. I learned slowly and painfully that I had merely moved into a house. The first year was a blur of usefulness. Their children, my grandchildren Caleb and Lily, were young, and I slipped back into the familiar, comforting rhythm of motherhood. I cooked their meals, the familiar scent of pot roast filling the kitchen on Sundays. I cleaned their home, mended scraped knees, and read bedtime stories until my voice grew hoarse. I became the quiet, reliable engine that kept their busy modern lives running. Mark and Brenda were building their business, a tech startup. They christened M&B Innovations, and they needed my silent, unpaid support. I was happy to give it. I watched them work late into the night, their faces illuminated by the glow of laptop screens, and I saw their success as my own. I was the foundation of their new world, unseen, but essential. And for a time, that was enough. But as the children grew older, needing me less, and the company became more successful, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. It was a subtle change, not a storm, but a slow, creeping frost. My role as a helper, slowly, almost imperceptibly, morphed into that of a burden. I was no longer Eleanor, the mother, the matriarch. I became the old woman who lived in the spare room down the hall, a piece of antique furniture they had to dust around. My opinions, once sought, were now tolerated with tight smiles. The stories I told of their own childhoods, once a source of laughter, were now met with impatient sighs. I was no longer a person with a history. I was a collection of inconvenient memories. I had become a tolerated ghost in my own son's home. The transformation was completed not with a single cruel act, but with 1,000 tiny cuts. They began to make decisions about the house, my house in all but name, on a deed without consulting me. They remodeled the kitchen, the heart of my old home, in a stark, cold style that felt alien to me. The warm oak cabinets were torn out, replaced by sterile white lacquer. I was a relic of a past they were actively trying to pave over. The change was most apparent at the dinner table. I would still cook the meals, but the conversation would flow around me, a river parting around a stone, leaving me in a silent eddy. I was there, but I wasn't. An empty chair at the head of the table would have had more presence. Mark, my son, who I had raised to be a man of principle like his father, began to avoid my gaze. He saw it all, but his silence was his answer. He had chosen his side, and it was not mine. He had mistaken my quiet endurance for acceptance, my silence for surrender. It was a mistake that would in the end cost him everything. The greatest cruelties are not always delivered in shouts, but in the quiet daily erosions of a person's soul. My mornings still began before anyone else's, filling the house with the smell of coffee and bacon, a ritual of care they had come to expect. But by the time Mark and Brenda came to the breakfast table, the conversation would flow around me as if I were, in fact, an empty chair. Brenda especially had mastered the art of polite erasure. She would ask my opinion on the color of a new sofa, her head tilted with feigned interest, and then order the exact opposite without a word of explanation. She would do the grocery shopping, forgetting the one type of Earl Grey tea I liked, week after week. I was served my meals on the chipped plates, the mismatched survivors from a set they had long since replaced. It was a small thing, a petty thing, but it was a message delivered 3 times a day. You are less. You are an afterthought. You are a burden. Mark my son. The boy I had raised to have a spine of steel, like his father, became a man of jelly in her presence. When Brenda would make a thinly veiled comment about the rising cost of feeding an extra mouth, Mark would simply stare down at his plate, his fork scraping against the ceramic. His silence was a betrayal louder than any insult she could ever utter. One afternoon, I was in my room mending a tear in Lily's favorite dress when I overheard Brenda on the phone in the hallway. Her voice was a saccharine poison dripping with contempt. "It's like living with a shadow," she said to her friend. "She's just there. Smells like mothballs and regret." I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just went on stitching, my needle moving in and out, as if I could sew up the wound that had just been torn open in my heart. Later, I folded the laundry I had done for them, their clothes still warm from the dryer, and the fabric absorbed the hot, silent tears I refused to let them see. But the deepest, cut the one that truly began the ledger of wrongs in my mind, came when M&B Innovations was just a fledgling dream. They were short on capital. A critical loan had fallen through, and I saw a panic in Mark's eyes that I hadn't seen since he was a boy who had broken a neighbor's window. Without a second thought, I went to the bank. I withdrew a significant portion of my life savings, the money James and I had painstakingly put away for my old age, for my security. I signed it over to them, my hand steady, my heart swelling with a mother's pride. "It's an investment," I told them, my voice full of hope for their future. "An investment in this family." They thanked me, their relief so palpable it was a physical presence in the room. But they never called it an investment again. In their minds, in their actions, it became something I simply owed them. It was the first entry in a ledger I never intended to keep, but which my heart was memorizing with perfect, painful clarity. My money became the foundation of their success, but I was the part of the foundation they chose to bury and forget. A person can become invisible in their own life. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens one small surrender at a time, one quiet concession after another, until you wake up one morning and realize you are merely a ghost haunting the edges of someone else's story. I went from homeowner to helper, and then from mother to maid. My belongings, the few precious, tangible items I had brought with me from the house on Maple Street, were slowly migrated. First, they were moved to the corners of the living room. Then, they were confined to my bedroom. Finally, most were packed into cardboard boxes and stacked in the cold, damp garage. Brenda was renovating again. A more modern aesthetic, she called it. Her voice, bright and brittle. What she meant was an aesthetic that had no room for my past, no place for my memories. The family photos on the mantelpiece, the ones of Mark as a boy with a missing front tooth, and of James and me on our wedding day, were replaced by sterile, meaningless abstract art. The worn, comfortable armchair my husband had loved, the one I had insisted on keeping, was banished to the basement because, as Brenda explained with a patient smile, it clashed with the new area rug. I was being systematically erased. It was not a violent act, not a cruelty loud enough for the neighbors to hear, but a quiet, efficient scrubbing of my existence from the canvas of their home. I was no longer a person. I was a problem of interior design, a piece of clutter to be managed. And Mark's complicity was a constant dull ache in my chest. He saw what was happening. He saw the way Brenda spoke to me, her words dripping with condescension. He saw the way my world was shrinking until it was confined to the four walls of my small bedroom. But he was caught in the web of the life they had built, a beautiful, prosperous life funded by my sacrifice, and he was too weak or perhaps too comfortable to untangle himself. He chose peace with his wife over justice for his mother. Love without respect is not love at all. It is a cage gilded with obligation. So I retreated further into my silence. I became the wallpaper, blending into the background so perfectly, they soon forgot I was even there. But quiet does not mean blind, and silent does not mean deaf. I observed. I listened. I heard their hushed arguments about money, the rising panic in their voices as their once thriving business began to falter. I learned to read the tension in the tight set of Mark's jaw, the frantic, incessant tapping of Brenda's perfectly manicured nails on her phone. They mistook my silence for senility, my quietness for surrender. They believed I was just an old woman with nowhere else to go, fading into oblivion. That was their final fatal mistake. My silence was not empty. It was filling up like a reservoir behind a dam, waiting for the one crack that would bring the whole thing down. There is a moment after years of quiet endurance when a long-suffering heart does not break. It shatters. But the sound is not a loud, dramatic explosion. It is a cold, clean snap, a sound only you can hear, marking the line between what you will tolerate and what you will not. For me, that moment arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, an ordinary day that would become the most significant of my life. The air in the house was thick with a new kind of desperation, sharp and metallic, like the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. A major client had pulled out of a contract, and M&B Innovations was on the verge of complete collapse. I knew this not because they deigned to tell me their silent live-in benefactor, but because the walls in that house had ears, and I had long ago learned to listen to their whispers of panic. They didn't look for a new investor. They didn't brainstorm solutions or tighten their belts. They didn't look at their own lavish spending or mismanagement. They looked for the easiest, most convenient solution. They came for me. Mark and Brenda entered my room without knocking. The courtesy of a knock had been discarded years ago, another small death of dignity. Brenda's face was a mask of cold, predatory resolve. Mark's was a pathetic mess of shame and weakness. Her eyes, like a vulture's, scanned my room, dismissing everything with a flicker of contempt until they landed on the antique mahogany jewelry box on my dresser. The one James had given me on our 10th anniversary, its wood polished smooth by my hands over decades. Inside lay 2 generations of memories. My mother's pearls, a tiny silver locket with my own baby picture inside and my wedding rings. The simple gold bands that represented a lifetime of love and partnership. "We need to talk, Eleanor." Brenda said her use of my first name a deliberate stripping of my maternal authority. Her voice was devoid of any warmth, a flat, transactional tone. She picked up the box, her fingers leaving smudges on the polished wood. "The company is in trouble. We need capital. Fast." I looked at Mark, my son, the boy whose tears I had wiped, whose fears I had soothed. He couldn't meet my eyes. He stared at a point on the floral wallpaper just over my shoulder. "Mom." He mumbled, his voice thick. "It's just stuff. Useless clutter just sitting in a drawer. Useless clutter. My wedding ring. The symbol of my life with his father. The man who had worked himself to an early grave to give this boy every opportunity." Brenda opened the box, her fingers rifling through the velvet compartments with the detached air of a pawnshop owner. "Selling this is the least you could do to save the family," she said, her tone making it chillingly clear that she considered me and everything I held dear as nothing more than a resource to be liquidated for their benefit. In that instant, something inside me didn't break. It froze. The years of pain, of being made small, of being erased, coalesced into a single diamond-hard point of cold, hard clarity. They were not saving the family. They were ransacking a tomb for spare parts. And I was done being the ghost that haunted it. The long, quiet winter of my endurance was over. A new season was about to begin. They thought the value was in the gold and the stones. They were so blinded by the glitter that they completely missed the true treasure. As Brenda's fingers sorted through my life's milestones, as if they were nothing more than pebbles on a beach, my eyes were fixed on the worn burgundy velvet lining at the bottom of the mahogany box. She was so focused on the tangible assets, the useless clutter she could quickly convert to cash, that she didn't notice my hand steady as a surgeon slipped into the box beside hers. My fingers didn't go for the rings or the pearls. They bypassed the cold metal and sought out the slight rectangular bulge beneath the fabric. With a movement so slight, it was almost imperceptible, a sleight of hand born of years of being unseen. I retrieved the single folded envelope that had rested there undisturbed for more than a decade. I didn't argue. I didn't plead or cry. I said nothing. I let them take the box. I watched them walk out of my room with the physical remnants of my past, their faces showing a grim, self-righteous satisfaction. They had what they wanted. They believed they had secured their victory. But as the door clicked shut behind them, I stood in the silence, holding what I needed. I closed my bedroom door, the sound a final, quiet punctuation mark on that chapter of my life. I sat on the edge of my bed, the worn quilt a small comfort. The envelope in my hand was brittle with age, the paper yellowed at the creases. Inside was a legal document, a stock certificate, its formal embossed lettering still sharp and clear. Decades ago, when James and I had given Mark the initial seed money for his very first and ultimately failed business venture, James, ever the pragmatist, had insisted on a condition. He had our lawyer, a shrewd but fair man named Walter Benedetti, draw up a contract. Our investment was not a gift to be squandered. It was a purchase of majority shares in whatever future enterprise our son created with that capital. When M&B Innovations was later formed, using the substantial savings I had given them, that original contract That forgotten promise automatically applied. I could still hear James's voice, a low rumble of wisdom and foresight. Paper doesn't forget Ellie, he had told me, tucking the envelope into the jewelry box himself, a secret kept in plain sight. Just in case the world or even our own children forget who laid the foundation for them. I looked at the certificate. My name, Eleanor J. Warren, was there in bold black ink. It stated in unequivocal legal terms that I held 51% of the voting shares. I was not a guest in their house. I was not a leech or a burden. I was the silent majority partner of the company that paid for it all. They had taken my memories. I was about to take back my reality. The foundation they thought they stood upon was about to reveal itself, and the entire house was about to shake. Justice doesn't always roar. It doesn't arrive with flashing lights and sirens. Sometimes it arrives with the quiet, decisive click of a telephone receiver and the calm, measured cadence of a voice that has decided it has been silent for far too long. I didn't waste a single moment on tears or anger. Those were currencies they no longer deserved from me. That part of my heart had closed for business. Instead, I walked over to the small secretary desk in the corner of my room, one of the few pieces of furniture from my old life that Brenda hadn't banished to the basement. I opened a faded, leather-bound address book, its pages filled with the elegant looping cursive of a life half forgotten. My finger wrinkled, but steady traced down the page until I found the entry I was looking for. Benedetti Walter, Law Offices. Walter was more than a lawyer. He was James's oldest and most trusted friend, a man who understood the sacred value of a promise. My hand was perfectly steady as I dialed the number from memory. When his longtime receptionist, a kind woman named Carol, put me through, Walter's voice was exactly as I remembered it, a low, reassuring baritone that had always sounded like common sense-given voice. "Eleanor, it's good to hear from you. Is everything all right?" he asked, a note of genuine concern in his tone. "Everything is perfectly clear now, Walter?" I said, and my own voice surprised me with its strength. It was the voice of the woman I used to be, the one who ran a household, balanced budgets, and faced the world head-on without flinching. There was no tremble, no hesitation, only the cold, hard steel of resolve. I explained the situation in calm procedural terms, laying out the facts as if I were a witness testifying in court. I told him about the jewelry box, about the careless cruelty, about the phrase, useless clutter. I told him about the stock certificate I held in my hand. And then I gave him the instructions, clear and simple. "Walter, I want to exercise my rights as the majority shareholder of M&B Innovations. Immediately. I want you to file the necessary papers to withdraw all of my original investment capital and freeze all company assets tied to the shares registered in my name. The name is Eleanor J. Warren." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, a pause so profound I could hear the faint hum of his office lights. Then a low, heavy sigh. "I see," Walter said, and I knew that he did. He knew James. He knew what this meant. He understood the story I wasn't telling, the years of pain behind the procedural request. "Consider it done, Eleanor. The necessary papers will be filed with the corporate commission by the end of the business day." I thanked him and hung up the phone. I sat there for a long moment in the quiet of my room. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was no longer a sign of my erasure. It was powerful. It was the calm before a storm of their own making. This was not revenge. Revenge is a hot, messy, emotional thing. This was a course correction. This was reality. And it was coming for them, delivered not by a wrathful ghost, but by a registered letter. The days that followed my call to Walter were a study in escalating panic. It did not begin with a bang, but with a low, anxious hum that slowly grew louder, filling every corner of the house. The first sign was a frantic phone call. Brenda took in the kitchen, her voice sharp and strained, slicing through the afternoon quiet. "What do you mean the payment was declined? That's impossible. Run it again." There was a long pause, and then her voice dropped to a furious whisper I couldn't quite decipher. The next day, Mark came home from work. Hours earlier than usual, his face the color of ash. He bypassed the living room where Brenda was pacing a trench into her expensive new rug and went straight to the liquor cabinet. He sat at the dinner table that night, pushing the pot roast I had made around his plate, his eyes staring at a future only he could see unraveling. He muttered something about the company's main account being under administrative review. It was a technical term, but the terror in his voice gave it a brutal clarity. They began to talk in hushed, frantic whispers when they thought I was out of earshot. Their words laced with accusations aimed at everyone but themselves. It was the bank's fault. It was a competitor's dirty trick. It was a sudden, unpredictable market downturn. They were like two spoiled children caught in a storm of their own making, shaking their fists and blaming the rain and the wind for their own foolishness in setting sail without checking the weather. I, in the meantime, continued my quiet routine. I made their coffee in the morning strong and black, just as they liked it. I folded their laundry, the clean scent of fabric softener, a stark contrast to the sour smell of fear that now clung to them. I offered them food they were too agitated to eat their plates, returning to the kitchen barely touched. My placid demeanor, my steady, unnerving calm, seemed to agitate them even more. They would look at me, this silent relic in the corner of their collapsing world, with a mixture of raw irritation and complete dismissive irrelevance. They had no idea that the calm, quiet eye of their hurricane was sitting right there in front of them, sipping her Earl Grey tea. One evening, Brenda announced with a grim sort of pride that the useless clutter from the jewelry box had been sold. The pittance they received for my mother's pearls and my wedding rings was, as they lamented loudly, barely enough to cover a single payroll for their employees. They had traded a kingdom for a handful of coins and didn't even know it. They thought they had sacrificed my past to save their future, when in reality, they had sacrificed their future for a pittance from my past. The irony was so thick, so bitter, I could almost taste it. But I said nothing. I just nodded a silent, knowing ghost and watched them spiral. The end came on a Friday. It didn't sneak in through a cracked window or a neglected back door. It kicked the front door down with the force of a battering ram. I was sitting in my usual armchair in the living room, the quiet lamplight pooling on the pages of my book when they burst in. They did not knock. They never did. Mark and Brenda looked as though they had been pulled from a shipwreck. Brenda, who prided herself on her immaculate appearance, had long black streaks of mascara running down her cheeks like war paint. Her expensive hairstyle was a tangled mess, as if she'd been clawing at it. Mark's silk tie, the one she'd bought him for their anniversary, was wrenched to the side, his collar unbuttoned. But it was his face that held the true story. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. "It's gone." Brenda whispered, her voice a ragged, cracking thing. She stumbled towards the center of the room, her hands fluttering uselessly at her sides. "Everything. It's all gone." Mark didn't speak. He just made a low, guttural sound and sank onto the new sofa. The fashionable, low-slung monstrosity they had insisted on buying to update the space, despite my protests. It had replaced the comfortable floral couch my husband and I had shared for 30 years. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving. The investors. They all pulled out. He finally choked out his voice, muffled by his palms. At the same time. Coordinated. "The bank just called. The accounts are frozen solid. Our key contracts have been nullified. Clause 7B. Financial instability. We're ruined." They became a whirlwind of grief and confusion. They paced the length of the Persian rug my father had given me, their frantic steps wearing a path of despair into its intricate patterns. They shouted, not always at each other, but at the air, at fate, at unseen enemies. They accused former partners of betrayal, bankers of cruelty. Then came the tears. Brenda's were loud, theatrical sobs. Mark's were silent, agonizing tremors that shook his entire body. They were so completely consumed by the sudden violent demolition of their world that for a full 5 minutes they did not seem to notice I was there. I was a part of the furniture, as silent and as overlooked as the grandfather clock in the hall. I let them exhaust their initial wave of hysteria. I have learned that great tempests of emotion always burn themselves out, leaving a vacuum in their wake. I waited for that moment, for the frantic energy to subside, leaving only the hollow, ringing echo of their failure. When the room fell into a quivering silence, broken only by Brenda's hiccuping breaths, I moved. I did not get up. I did not clear my throat. I simply closed my book, the soft thud of the cover startlingly loud. I took the thin silk bookmark and placed it carefully between the pages to save my place. Then my hand moved to the small mahogany end table beside my chair. I reached for the single crisp envelope that had been resting there since noon. I held it out. The simple motion cut through the stagnant air. Mark lifted his head slowly from his hands. His eyes, red-rimmed and swollen, finally focused on me. There was a flicker of deep confusion in them, as if he was struggling to place who I was and what I was doing in his private tragedy. He looked at the stark white envelope, then back at my face, and for the first time in years he seemed to truly see me. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out a hand that trembled like a leaf in a storm. His fingers brushed against mine as he took the envelope. The paper was cool and smooth against his overheated skin. He fumbled with the seal, his movements clumsy with shock. He pulled out the single sheet of heavy water-marked paper inside. His eyes scanned the letterhead first. Walter Benedetti, attorney at law. He knew the name. My late husband's lawyer. My lawyer. The guardian of our family's affairs for 2 generations. Then he read the single damning paragraph. It was an official notarized copy of the withdrawal notice submitted to the board of his primary investor group. The notice declared the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of the entirety of the founding capital seed fund, the one established by my husband's estate. The very money they had leveraged to build their fragile empire, money they spoke of as if it had sprung from their own brilliance, not from the bedrock of a life they had long since dismissed. as irrelevant. The withdrawal was signed by the fund's sole trustee, me. The color drained from Mark's face as he read the document. It was as if someone had pulled a plug and emptied him of all life. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. He looked from the paper in his trembling hand to me, his eyes wide with a dawning, monstrous comprehension. The ghost in his house, the furniture he had learned to ignore, had just handed him his own eviction notice. He finally truly understood. Brenda, ever impatient and angry, snatched the paper from his limp grasp. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, flew across the page. I watched the rapid sequence of emotions play out on her face, a silent, flickering film of her own demise. First there was confusion as she tried to make sense of the legal jargon. Then a flash of indignant rage, the arrogance of a queen who has just been told her castle is built on sand. And finally, the cold, creeping, undeniable dread of absolute and total defeat. Her gaze snapped up from the paper to meet mine. "You," she hissed the word, a poisoned dart, the last weapon in her depleted arsenal. "This was you." I remained seated, my hands folded calmly in my lap. The power in the room had shifted so completely, it was almost a physical force. They were standing frantic and broken, their expensive clothes looking like costumes on terrified actors. I was sitting whole and in control, the quiet author of their final act. "You can't do this." Brenda stammered, her voice shifting abruptly from anger to a desperate, wheedling plea. It was the pathetic sound of a bully who had just met a force she couldn't intimidate. "Mark, tell her she can't do this. This is our company. We built it." But Mark was still staring at me, at the mother he had allowed to be erased. He was staring at the ghost who had just proven she was, in fact, the foundation. "Mom, why?" He finally managed to ask, his voice small, and lost the voice of the little boy he once was. I looked at my son, at the man who had stood by and watched my slow, painful erasure, and I spoke. My voice was not loud, but it filled the cavernous, ringing silence of their ruined lives. "You asked me to save the family," I said softly, each word chosen with decades of care. "And I did. I saved it from you." I then rose from my chair, my movements deliberate and unhurried. I was no longer a ghost. I was a solid, undeniable presence. "The business you built on my back is no longer yours to ruin." I told them, my voice calm and clear. "You called my past useless clutter. You forgot that my past was your foundation. And when the foundation is removed, the house falls." I turned and walked toward the hallway, where my single small suitcase had been waiting by the front door since my call to Walter. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The sound of their world falling apart, the shattering of Brenda's first sob, was all the goodbye I required. I opened the door and walked out into the clean, crisp air of my new life. I now live in a small one-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. It has a large window that faces east, and every morning the sun spills across the polished wooden floorboards like warm honey. It is not a grand house. It is not filled with expensive things or the latest modern aesthetics. But every single thing in it, from the sturdy armchair to the simple white dishes, is mine. The teacup I drink from has no chips. The chair I read in holds no ghosts of past insults. The silence is not a weapon used against me. It is a peaceful, welcome friend. I didn't keep the company. There was no joy for me in presiding over the ruins of their ambition. Walter helped me liquidate my shares, a process that was swift and clean. I used the funds to secure this new life for myself and to set up educational trusts for my grandchildren, Caleb and Lily. They are the only part of that life, the only true treasure that I chose to keep. They were innocent in all of this, and they deserved a future free from the shadow of their parents' greed. I didn't lose a home that day. I reclaimed a world. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but what I did was never about revenge. Revenge is a hot, bitter meal that poisons the person who serves it. This was about restoration. The restoration of dignity. The restoration of self. The simple, quiet act of remembering who I was when everyone else, including my own son, had forgotten. They mistook my kindness for weakness and my silence for consent. They learned far too late that I was never a parasite clinging to them for survival. I was the host. I was the foundation. And when the foundation quietly walks away, the whole house falls. So if you are listening to this, if my story has stirred something inside of you, I want you to hear this. If you have ever been made to feel like a guest in a life you helped build, if you have ever been called a burden by the very people you have carried on your back, you are not alone. Your worth does not expire with age, and it is not measured by your usefulness to others. It is inherent. It is absolute. Do not let them turn you into a stranger in the house of your own life. Keep your name on your dignity. Keep your name on the deed. And remember that paper, unlike people, never forgets. If this story has resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe to Her Quiet Revenge: True Stories. Because here in this space, every mother has a voice. Every sacrifice is remembered, and every tear has a reason. Here we know that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply signs its name on the bottom line. Thank you for listening to this story. If it resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to Her Quiet Revenge: True Stories and hit the notification bell. Here we believe that every story of quiet strength deserves to be heard. Join our community and never miss a tale of dignity restored. We'll see you in the next story.